How does one begin to think about the metaphysics? How would you introduce a class to the core of the metaphysics?
Ultimately, the modalities are essentially an archetype of concepts. So the modalities aren't represented by any specific instantiation of concepts. Modalities are essentially the ways concepts come into relationship with each other. And so the pattern of those relationships is described by the axioms, and the instances of the things that are related are described by the modalities. But the notion of thingness itself is a concept. So I can't use the word thing to describe the modalities, because ultimately the modalities are deeper or more abstract or somehow more remote than even the concept of thingness. So this is a little tricky. This is part of the reason why teaching the metaphysics is very challenging, because to some extent we're needing to do a kind of transition that allows us to sense the modalities independently of the examples. So if we're looking at the book, right? Like I said, normally what I would do is I would sort of give some examples, and I'll do that. For example, if we're looking at the concept of relationship, there are three kinds of relationship. There are three archetypes of the notion of relationship: similarity, proximity, and inclusion. Now, I'm using the word relationship more in the sense of how it's described mathematically, or how it's described in the sense of patterns. If I was talking about human relationships, of course, human relationships are way more complicated than math. So if I'm really just trying to get down to the essence of the notion of relationship as a kind of concept, then I'm really trying to describe a very basic notion of relationship, a very simple version of it. And then to essentially describe it in terms of even simpler patterns. So to in a sense get the archetype of relationship, one way to sort of do that is to simply say, can we imagine any version of the notion of relationship that isn't somehow an exemplar of similarity, proximity, or inclusion, or some mixture of just those three? Now, this would be an exercise. Like I said, in a classical process, if we were running a dojo or martial arts training or something like that, I would literally stop here and I would say, meditate on these things for at least a few weeks, right? It's like a Zen practice, imagine one hand clapping, where you're trying to get from the abstraction to the embodiment, right? There's like a sort of magical moment where the koan all of a sudden makes sense. But in this particular case, we have to, because of the nature of our situation, I'm going to have to basically move through a whole bunch of these sorts of processes that normally would be something that a person would meditate on in time. So this is part of the reason why the reading was given in advance, was to just give you at least a hint as to where some of this would go. So again, going back to the syllabus, to get a feel for the modalities, to talk about essentially the origins of, like, what are the conceptual underpinnings that sort of hold the ideas of the metaphysics together, then the axioms, then a few more examples, then essentially connecting the examples to primary concepts. So I mentioned the concept of relationship. Well, the notion of relationship as a concept, it doesn't just have three archetypal forms, it also has three, it's part of it is itself part of a trinity. So I can think about relationships in domains between identities. And the notion of identity is an abstraction. The notion of relationships abstraction, the notion of a domain is abstraction. But they happen to be the kinds of abstractions that are really, really relevant, because anytime we're talking about a model or a map, we're implicitly pulling in these concepts. So for example, we talked about the map and the territory a minute ago. The map and the language of the map, right? So symbols for cities and lines for roads, and maybe I might put some places that are blue and call that water, and other places that have sort of triangle shapes, and I'd say those are mountains. Now, in the world of the map, what I have are the kinds of identities of the kinds of objects are lines on paper and colors and shapes. And that domain is in correspondence to a world, the territory that is in a sense being described by the map. And so we could talk about the world as a place. It has objects, trees and roads and cities and people and stuff like that. And the map isn't trying to represent all those things, but in effect, we're talking about a world in which stuff lives. Again, roads and stuff. And each of these things, like there's a city here and there's a city over there, those are real things, and the relationships between them are in real space. And so in effect, I can be talking about the things, cities, the relationships between them, maybe roads or territory, right? And then the domain, i.e. the enclosure, the world. And then I can talk about the world of the map and its things, lines on a piece of paper, connecting symbols that represent cities or names or words and stuff like that, all drawn out, right? And so again, I'm talking about domains, relations, and identities. Now, both of these things, now when I say things, just bear in mind, we're talking about this more general concept, but I have relationship that is archetypally understood as similarity, proximity, and inclusion. That's a threeness. And then I have the threeness of domains, relations, and identities. And here's what's surprising. That notion of threeness applies in every constellation of concepts that are at the foundation of a domain. And the pattern of the relationships between those three concepts turns out to be the same pattern for every domain. So once we get to the place where we're sort of understanding, or at least beginning to appreciate these sort of underlying patterns, then we can begin to see from the underside, from the inside of every domain that there is, every aspect of life, every deep understanding of the universe, all of a sudden starts to come in. And Ben, you're correctly anticipating. So the idea that every domain has three concepts is called foundational triplication, i.e. that the foundation of a domain is realizable in terms of just three concepts. And this is surprising, but if you examine it, it turns out to be true for everything I've ever looked at. Now, this is, of course, at the foundation of a domain. If you go up into the domain and you start looking at, all of the superstructure of it, of course, things get complicated quickly. But if we go for essentially the root of the domain, and there's a kind of way of doing that, then there's a sort of underlying simplicity that the space of the domain can, in a sense, be held as a superposition of just three archetypal concepts. So that's foundational triplication. The notion that the pattern of the relationship between these three fundamental concepts is the same pattern in every domain, and that, in effect, we can correspond the concepts in any one domain to the concepts of another domain through this substrate relationship. That also is a surprising thing. And that process, or that observation, has the name of type isomorphism. And I realize that the language of foundational triplication and type isomorphism isn't necessarily intuitive. There's a sense in which the language here is a technical language, right? It's a thing that would probably make more sense to people that are deeply interested in philosophy and have studied that most of their lives. But it's important to mention because these are the orienting ideas that basically are the place from which the metaphysics departs from conventional philosophy. Conventional philosophy basically has two technical terms that it holds as how it holds the world, how it thinks about life, the universe, and everything. For the conventional philosophy, the ideas started with dualism, i.e. that there's the world of matter and there's the world of spirit, or the world of mind. And that, we think of people living in ancient times, a few hundred years ago. And, they knew that they were alive. They had firsthand experience of the world. And they knew there was the world, right? They were experiencing something. And so in this sense, there was this sort of curiosity about the being of the world and the being of the self, right? So you look at the Greeks, for example, they talk about, know thyself, right? And they had a deep curiosity about the world. They tried to figure out, the notion of atomic, for example, comes from them. Atom, meaning unsplittable. Like, what is the simplest component out of which materials are made? And of course, a lot of time later, we've learned that atomic theory is actually a real way to understand the world, that we can think about things in terms of unsplittable ideas. Of course, we did eventually learn that we could split the atom, but then we find out yet another thing that's unsplittable. And so you have subatomic particles, right? Subatom. And those particles were for a while treated as unsplittable, but then they figured out a way to split those, and now you end up with quarks. And interestingly enough, there are 6 quarks as 3 pairs of 2. And this pattern, of course, shows up in the metaphysics, at which point we can probably say that's as far down as you're likely to ever be able to go, for reasons that will only become clear probably in another year. But in effect, the notion here is that there was this idea of dualism of mind and matter, and that eventually we came to understand matter pretty well. And there was this sort of idea called epiphenomenalism, that mind and spirit come out of matter, that there's only matter, and that our beings and our consciousness and so on and so forth is dependent upon these things called brains, and that this is how the universe is understood. So it went from dualism to physical monism. And Western philosophy, for the most part, has been physical monist since probably about 200 or 300 years ago. Now, what I'm teaching today is not Western philosophy. It's something altogether different than that. Now, at some point, we're going to be able to account for Western philosophy from within the metaphysics, but we're not going to be able to account for the metaphysics from within Western philosophy, because the metaphysics assumes neither thing of dualism, nor does it assume monism. It assumes foundational triplication. So rather than having the world be based upon 2 primary kinds of reality, the subjective and the objective, or 1 kind of reality, physical substance, it instead says, actually, the simplest possible concept we could have is that there's 3 kinds of reality, or rather, reality itself can only be understood in this sort of triplicate way, and that this is the simplest possible notion. Now, of course, this is counterintuitive to a lot of people, because they would say something like, well, isn't 2 and 1 simpler than 3? And I would say, well, at first it would seem so. But in actual fact, everything that we think is 1 turns out to be 2, and the relationship between 2 and 1 turns out to be 3. And that in effect, if we're really wanting to understand the nature of things, it turns out that even the process by which we understand it includes that notion of 3ness. I'll give you an example. We're talking about all of life, the universe, and everything. Well, we can take the concept of universe and say, what would we need to do? Just asking the question, what would we need to do if we needed to understand the universe? What would we need to know? Well, I would need to know something about creation. How did the universe get here? How did it come to be? Right? These are metaphysical questions ultimately, but in this case, we're just treating them as questions. They're technical questions in a sense. Then I would also need to know something about existence. What does it mean to be? But that's not enough, because things just don't sit there in space. They bump into one another. They have chemistry, and suns happen, and life happens on the planet, and things move and change all the time, right? So now I've got to understand interactions. I got to understand the notion of motion and process. But let me ask you this. Let's say somehow or another, you would come to know everything there was to know about creation, everything there was to know about existence, and everything there was to know about interaction. would you at that moment understand everything there is to know about the universe? And this would be another koan and another meditation. And a few weeks later, I would come back and I would ask you, is there anything other than that is part of the universe that is not at once partaking of creation, existence, and interaction? So at this moment, I should probably play the Jeopardy song and then see whether or not anybody comes up as a contestant. Is there any sense in which the notion of creation, existence, and interaction taken together does not subsume the notion of universe? What I'm pointing out here is that the usual way of thinking of things is that the universe is some sort of container for a bunch of stuff. But what we're doing here is we're saying, actually, it's still a container, but it's not a container of stuff. It's a container of concepts. And the three concepts are existence, creation, and interaction. Without those three concepts, we don't have a concept of the universe. We don't know what the word universe means. We have no way of learning what the universe is except through the vehicle of these three concepts.